All right, welcome everyone. I just wanted to start off by quickly noting that today's session is being recorded. So those who can't join us this evening will have the opportunity to benefit from hearing this discussion later. You are welcome to keep your video on, but if you don't wish to be recorded, you can please turn off your video now. The audience Q&A session at the end is not going to be recorded, so if you do feel more comfortable re-enabling your video at that time. So I'm Angela Harris, Associate Director of Employer Engagement for those who don't know me. And we also have with us Rosie on the call. If you want to introduce yourself.
Sure. Hello, everybody. I'm Rosie Gallant. I'm the Director of Employer Engagement, so I'm part of the Career Connections team.
And I did just want to give a quick shout out to Michael Vidal, who I think is on the call today, Director for Diversity and Inclusive Excellence at Clark's Office of Diversity and Inclusion, who's joining us, and thank him for his support in connecting with some of our panelists. So today's panel of professionals represent regional and national employers whose role is to advance diversity, equity, and inclusion within their organizations and the communities that they serve. The purpose of this event is to provide you with insight on how to assess workplace culture for your own needs and interests. So a few learning goals for today's session, learning how to research and assess an organization's values, culture, and commitment to diversity and inclusion as a job and internship seeker. What it means to be an inclusive workplace and how organizations measure diversity and inclusion, what are diversity and recruitment strategies and what that means for students as job seekers, and what type of questions you can ask in the application and interview process to better understand the culture of an organization. So our panel speakers today include Rodney Marshall, Programs Manager of Communication and Partnerships for the Office of Diversity and Inclusion Services at American Red Cross. Grace Moreno, Executive Director at the Massachusetts LGBT Chamber of Commerce. Iana Pilgrim-Brown, Manager of Diversity and Recruiting Strategy and Human Resources and a Clark alum at the Vanguard Group. And Ildemaro Gonzalez, Vice President and Chief Inclusion and Diversity Officer at Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. So we really do appreciate all of our panelists and our student participants joining us for today's discussion. So we're going to begin with panelist introductions and then move directly into our panel discussion. We do ask that you remain muted during the main panel, but you will have the opportunity to ask questions of our panelists during the audience Q&A, and I definitely strongly encourage you to do so. You can type any questions that you have during the panel into the chat to be asked later during the Q&A. And when typing your questions, please begin by stating either "please ask for me" if you would like us to read your question, or "will ask myself" to be called on to ask your question. During the Q&A, you can also use Zoom's raise hand feature to be called on to ask your question via video or audio. If you would like us to read your question anonymously to the group, you can either private chat myself or Rosie, and we'll remind you of these options again at the start of the Q&A. So now I'd like to turn it over to our panelist speakers to introduce themselves. If each of you would like to, again, provide your name, title, and organization, as well as maybe a brief 2-minute overview of your current role, professional background, and how you came to work in your field. So I guess we can start with Iana.
Thank you so much. It's great to be here as a Clarkie, as a proud alum. Glad to be here with our fellow panelists. So I serve, as was mentioned, as a manager of diversity recruiting strategy at Vanguard. Vanguard is one of the largest investment firms. We do a lot of business throughout the US and abroad. It's really been a great pleasure for me to work at the company for the last 2 years, really helping to drive enterprise-wide diversity attraction and acquisition efforts for the company. So I have oversight to diversity attraction across talent segments. I'm a longtime recruiter, been in recruiting since I recruited at the admissions office, assisting Angela Plant as the former diversity recruiter there at Clark. Got bit by the recruiting bug early, and then it just never stopped. So glad to be doing this work and glad to be with you today.
Thank you. And let's go to Ildemaro.
Good evening, everyone. I'm Ildemaro Gonzalez, and Vice President of Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity at the Dana-Farber Cancer Institute. I've been both at the Institute and in Boston for the past 18 months. and I basically have responsibility for all inclusion, diversity, and equity work in the organization. So this includes our different aspects of research, clinical care, talent, and then interactions with the community and partnering with our community. And I came to this role, you would ask, how did you come into this role? I didn't grow up in sixth grade thinking I was going to work in inclusion, diversity, and equity. However, I came into this role as a graduate intern, being an international student and having the opportunity to do a graduate internship at the American Cancer Society. So we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But that's a little bit about me. A pleasure to be here.
Rodney?
Hello, everyone. Rodney Marshall, the American Red Cross Programs Manager specializing in communication and partnerships. And I got to say, very much like Ildemaro, I can't say I woke up dreaming to work in the space of diversity and inclusion services, but I certainly love the work. My background is communication. I'm a graduate of North Carolina State University, so I've always been a writer, a communicator of sorts, but ended up in this work maybe 17 years ago at Hilton Hotels Corporation, and fell in love with the work. And so from there, continued to stay into that in D&I, and that migrated into an opportunity with the American Red Cross, where I've been for the past 5 years. So Angela, thank you for the invite today. I look forward to today's conversation.
Thank you. I'm glad to have you. Grace?
Hello, everyone. And just when I got unmuted, my dog barked. So she says hello too. There are children around, so they might greet you all. Things many of you don't have to worry about right now, hopefully. My name is Grace Moreno, and I am the Executive Director of the Massachusetts LGBT Chamber of Commerce. I also did not wake up one day in Mexico saying, I want to do diversity, inclusion, and equity work, because I didn't even know that existed. For that matter, I didn't even know that being LGBTQ was a thing. I was very clear I wasn't going to marry any guys, but I didn't know what that meant. And so immigrating into this country as a Mexican at the age of 16, going to school in Texas, I graduated from Rice University, and then migrating to the Northeast has definitely been a work in diversity, inclusion, and equity, or an experience in that. I came to the work at the Chamber because I found myself having sold a small business that for the first time in my life allowed me not to have to get a job right away for the first time in my whole life. And found very quickly that within the LGBTQ community, there are every color, every size, every gender, everything. So being a part of that acronym is actually an exercise in diversity and in inclusion, and in equity, because there is inequity within our own acronym. So I look forward to talking about that with you all, and telling you how 50 of the most progressive companies in Massachusetts are paying a lot of attention to how they recruit you as talent to be a part of the organizations, because they're all competing for you, and they all know that this is important. This is an important topic to you.
Great. Thank you so much to all of you for sharing those overviews. And we're just going to move into our first question. So from your perspective, or your organization's perspective, what makes an inclusive workplace? What are some of the ways your organization works to build an inclusive culture? So Ildemaro, would you like to begin?
Absolutely. And in my mind, the most critical aspect of is it part of the culture is when you get an opportunity to see the organization's strategic priorities, their plans, however they communicate it in their website when they're saying these are our priorities. If you see inclusion, diversity, and equity weaved throughout everything they're doing, that's a key sign of, this organization's looking to truly be an inclusive organization. And what I mean by that, in our example is, as I said, we focus on research. So what are we doing under research? And we are, specifically working to increase minority representation in our trials, and over 1,100 of them. What are we doing around clinical care? Enhancing the experience of diverse patients, right? And how do we interact, and how does that our clinicians impact the outcome and experience. Of course, in the recruitment, and this is, every organization, as Grace was saying, is going to come out and say, we're looking to build a diverse workforce. These days, it would be highly unlikely that any organization wouldn't put that out there. The key in identifying who's truly doing it as part of a culture and who's doing it in a performative way is when you see them beyond the HR aspects of it. And then, in our fourth focus being community. So what are we doing overall? So to me, number one is where it lands, where does it report, how is it integrated into everything we do? Two, we're building it, and we think that's part of our path to success in this is to truly engaging all of our workforce in an educational program around inclusive leadership, around unconscious bias, around bystander training, and so on and so forth, but also tying it to then executive compensation, which is then what drives. If you don't measure it, if you don't reward it, if you don't incentivize it, it doesn't happen. So I'm going to let my other colleagues on the panel take a stab at it too.
Yeah,
anyone that would like to go next?
Yeah, I'm shaking my head in the amen choir there. I agree with much of what you just shared, right? And I see hands going up as well. I think it's really important that it has to be integrative, right? It has to weave through and permeate every facet of the organization in order for you as a candidate, as a student, as a prospective talent to be able to discern if that company is really doing it, or to the prior point, is it performative and it's just kind of a Band-Aid approach. I think what is interesting, what we're seeing now with the broader reckoning for racial equity and justice, we're seeing companies kind of be called out on that appropriately so, right? Are you just joining along with the hashtag? Or if we look under the covers, are you really doing some of the things that were mentioned? Are you investing in the community? Are your processes designed in a way that they lend itself to inclusive hiring and advancement, even when people are in the organization? So I think it has to be multifaceted. I'm thinking through the candidate lens as I'm reviewing an organization. I'm going to be looking at, as was mentioned, board, diversity all the way down, right? Not just looking at the macro level statistics around maybe representation, but trying to drill down to see if that permeates throughout the organization or if there are some issues that exist there.
I am in that same amen choir with you guys. What I've seen is the competitiveness that big organizations in Boston and around have gone into when it comes to talent recruitment. It used to be that a company could say, oh, we're inclusive, but then they wouldn't have anything in their profile that really showed it. It became very clear, and I try to think about this, is this one of those by any means necessary, or do people have to be really true about it, right? And in my view, I don't care how you get to it, as long as you get to it, right? So if senior executives and CEOs of companies start to say, hey, we're losing talent to these other guys because they have structures in place to welcome some of the new talent that's coming into the field, and we're losing ground, and this is really about our bottom line, I don't care. As long as you start to build your organization to really be supportive. I mean, I think recruiting diverse talent isn't difficult. People will say it is, but it isn't difficult. It's keeping diverse talent in your organization. And the way you keep diverse talent in your organization is to really walk the walk, right? So you as a candidate have every right to ask the hard questions in your interview, to do the research, to be able to say, I'm curious, why are they only white men on your board? And if that at that point, that recruiter doesn't call you back, you don't want to work there, right? If you're truly looking for an inclusive workplace. And I think that I remember being a 21-year-old looking for a job, and you don't want to ask any questions that are going to, especially since this was, like in 1902, you don't want to ask any questions that are going to, make you seem like a difficult candidate. Well, come to find out that this new generation thrives on being difficult candidates, right? Because you want to ask the hard questions, because it really matters to this generation about what companies are doing. I have heard time and time again in our work fairs that are specifically geared to LGBTQ candidates, and our 52 corporate partners come, and they're the big four, they're all the insurances, their State Street, their biotechs. They come and the question that gets asked of them is, well, what do I don't care how much you're going to pay me. This company might pay me $60,000 and you might pay me $57,000, and $3,000 isn't going to make it. I want to know how you support LGBTQ people, how you support women, how you support people of color. What's your position on anti-racism? How can I be a part of that? Because this is a part of my life. Now, for some of us who have been in the field for a long time, it's a little bit shocking because we didn't ask those questions. When I was 21, we didn't dare. I was in Houston, Texas. There's no way I was going to ask any of those questions. But now, companies who are really walking the walk will say, hey, check this kid out. Like, he's got, not only does he's got a good resume, but here's a white guy, right, who's 22 years old, asking questions about really learning how to be a white guy in a world where he needs to be representing, and holding space for true equity and true inclusion. And I think that the right place will take a view of that and say, oh, this is a person we want to talk to.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think my colleagues have summed it up here, and I'll just say at the Red Cross, I'll really reiterate, if you look at the Red Cross and you think about the primary areas in which we serve the community, right? We're looking at disaster services, we're looking at blood services, and the trainings that we provide, first aid, AED, CPR. And so to Grace's point, Ildemaro's point, Ayana's point, you want to look at all three of those areas and ask the question, so what are you doing in the D&I space? How are you making these resources most inclusive in each of these three areas, right? Are you reaching indeed diverse communities? Do you have diverse leadership piloting these efforts? Are you making your resources accessible, to all communities that you need to serve? And if any of those gaps exist, those are red flags. And so I think, again, my colleagues summed it up. You really want to hone in to make sure that the D&I piece is woven throughout all aspects of the business.
And one quick note for those of you looking for a job and interviews, find out what their ERGs are. Do you have an employee resource group for Black young men or for Black young professionals? Do you have an employee resource group for women? Do you have an LGBTQ resource group? Because those are the groups that the companies are really supporting to get feedback to the top of the chain about what the experience is of that specific affinity in the organization. And again, they're not just doing this to be good guys or to be nice guys. Some of them are, but they're doing it because it's a business advantage, right? Frito-Lay had their Latino ERG come up with the fact that most Latinos put lime and hot sauce on their chips, right? So what did they do? They created a product that has the lime and hot sauce on it, and it's their best seller in all of Latin America, okay? So it's a business advantage, but they're also being diverse by offering a product in the countries where that is a thing. So ask that question.
So two things I want to add before we move on. And Grace has alluded to it over and over again. At the end of the day, in your questioning, you want to understand if the recruiter or a panel or the interviewer, the hiring manager, whoever you're talking to, understands the connection between inclusion, diversity, and equity and business outcomes. Because if that connection is not there, if when you ask the question, hey, what are you doing around inclusion, diversity, and equity, everything is about recruiting diverse talent, then to me, that would be a clue to say they're really not weaving diversity into their organizational outcomes. That's my one point. And the other point is, when you ask the questions around, hey, what are you doing? Can you share with me your strategy? And if you look at an organization and the leadership is all white or the board, then the follow-up question is, before you make judgment on the company, is what are you doing to change that? Because quite frankly, in Boston, most diversity at the top, the differentiators, those that are okay with it and those that are actively putting money and intent and accountability towards changing it.
That's an excellent point.
Thank you all. And move on to our next question. How does having a diverse organization and a commitment to an inclusive workplace impact the work and mission of your organization? I think Rodney started talking about this, if you'd like to begin.
Yeah, sure, Angela, absolutely. So for us, You know, again, our mission at the Red Cross is to alleviate human suffering for all mankind, right? Well, we know all man, womankind, non-binary, there's a lot of difference there. We can't speak with just one voice and expect the greater, the greater human capital to be able to respond to that just by us speaking in one voice. We have to be able to be culturally competent in how we reach the communities we intend to serve. And so for us, the best way to ensure cultural competencies, cultural proficiency, is to diversify and be inclusive in who we have on board to represent Red Cross in the communities we serve. The greatest example I use is this. I may love and have an affinity for and appreciation for my Latino brothers, sisters, and non-binary individuals, but I don't speak Spanish, right? So I can go out there and try my best to reach the Latino community, but I don't speak the language. So Red Cross then should hire proficient cultural competent experts, right? And to me, you're an expert, you're culturally competent when you're a part of that community, when you know the language, you know the nuance. Grace spoke to this earlier about affinity groups and resource groups. Those groups know, those groups are formed because they know intimately those communities. So having that cultural competency represented internally and then leveraging that to reach diverse communities, to me, that is the best way to ensure that the Red Cross mission is indeed fulfilled.
It's an excellent. Oh, go ahead, Grace.
Oh, go ahead, Anna, go ahead.
You can go ahead. You can go first.
I'll go first. So and I think that what I see over and over in corporations again is that they are realizing that not having those affinity groups is a deficit to their game, right? So I remember working at the Prudential Insurance when I was a young person, and I was in the communications department or whatever, and they were trying to think of a commercial to run in Spanish, and they were trying to run it like at 3 p.m. And what I said is like, don't you know that every person in my culture is sitting in front of their TV between the telenovela that starts at like 5 and 6? Like at 3 o'clock is when we're having our big meal. Nobody's watching telly at that time, but nobody misses, whatever Vanessa or whatever the novela was at the time. And you're going to capture that audience at that time. If you don't have somebody in the group who understands the culture, you're a step behind, right? Nowadays, we have all kinds of, this was, 25 years ago, but nowadays you have all kinds of media access that will tell you when people are watching or not watching. But there are other nuances to culture that, when is Pride Month? Does anybody know? Pride Month is July. June and July are Pride Months in the country, right? If you're doing something to highlight LGBTQ community, those are things you have to know. And the community and the affinity group is going to inform that. So, really looking at the mission, and some of that language is important, but then also looking at the actions. How are people showing up to these various events? How did people respond? How did this company respond 4 months ago when all the various things happen that have been happening since Rodney King, but that they've been happening forever, that have been recorded since Rodney King, right? They've been happening. I got an email from Uber that said, if you are not in support of anti-racism, delete this app. And I was like, dang, I wonder how many people deleted that app, because that's bold, right? And so you know what? I'm going to write Uber, because they are putting a statement out saying, if you are not anti-racist, delete this app, which means they don't want your business. And that is companies who are really talking about anti-racism and inclusion will make those bold statements.
Yeah, I'll piggyback on where you left off. I think you're right. They'll make the bold statements, but I think they'll also, couple it with action, like what you described, right? Like make the statement, but drive it down in the way that they're operating their business. I think just, to go back to, talking about how diversity and inclusive kind of environments can drive mission and the organizational impact. I think it's critical to organizational impact. I think it accelerates outcomes when an organization is more diverse. And I think, to previous comments, it helps the organization to better serve certain segments of our community that haven't been served, right? So I sit in investments. Let's think about that, right? I was just talking about that with a colleague earlier. Black people were the first bonds. So there's a history, right? There's a history and a legacy there that we can't ignore. So I think what has been discussed more recently in broader news, certain CEOs making statements around, we can't find the talent, we don't know where the talent is, it's not there, which is not true. The talent is there, but where we in industry realize that there's a gap in the talent pipeline, which there might be historic and systemic reasons why there is a gap, we have an obligation to assess how we can fill that gap. And to previous comments, as you as a candidate, you can ask the question, well, we see that it's, the percentage is a little bit low of representation at this level or that level or in this area of work. What are you working to do to alleviate that? So I think it's critical to any organization's success to make sure that it is both diverse and inclusive. I think the inclusive part is oftentimes pretty difficult because it involves systemic changes and cultural shifts that take time, right? They take time.
And to follow up on Ayana's point there, if the real benefit of diversity comes through the inclusion component of it, right? It's not you just have this revolving door where you're bringing people in and you're not leveraging. So I'm in healthcare, as you all know. When I think of how does a diverse organization, how the commitment impacts our mission, I always use this example. We're both a research organization and a clinical care organization. And very simply put, and I'm going to go into a story here for 1 minute. When talking to one of our researchers, when they were bringing one of the drugs to market, Gleevec, and he mentioned, hey, everyone around the world was loving the drug. And so we got a call from Japan. And they said, your drug is toxic. And when they go into, further looking into the issue, they realize that the high sodium diet in the country was reacting with the drug. People were retaining fluids. So the solve was quick. But the root cause was, hey, we missed that population in the trials. So you may have seen in the news now, everyone, AstraZeneca and the others, are saying, oh, we want to make sure that we have a diverse, patient population for our vaccine trials. Why? Because typically vaccines are tried on healthy, middle-aged, white individuals that then don't necessarily have, the same preferences, biology, or so on and so forth as other groups. So that's how it impacts. So that's what diversity does. What having the inclusive work culture means is that then you have people designing for inclusion. So on the onset of the trial, you design for it. When you're looking at patient experience, then you design for, all right, how does a limited English proficiency patient, someone who could not speak English, how do we serve this person? How does the person walk, access, understands, follow treatments, so on and so forth? How does an LGBTQ couple that comes in feels welcomed into our environment? We have metrics to determine, the differences in these perceptions. But the key of inclusion is that you have people designing for inclusion versus doing everything one way. And let's say it, websites, pamphlets, collateral materials. Remember the time where they were done in English and then they were simply translated, or a commercial? Same commercial worldwide, it was just dubbed into different languages. That tells you there's not an inclusive workplace there. The culture is then you design the commercial from the beginning for the audience you're trying to impact. And that's, to me, the clear two examples of how diversity and inclusion impact the mission through the organization.
Moving on to our next question. How has COVID-19 impacted your work towards the advancement of DEI within your organization and or the communities that you serve?
I want to start that one and just because I'm not at one of these employers, I'm at frankly, I think COVID-19 and then the racism and the anti-justice stuff that happened kind of really crystallized how much work there is needed to be inclusive and equitable. If you look at the numbers, and those of my colleagues that are in healthcare, you can see that the communities that are dying and the communities that are getting affected and the communities that are getting sick are the brown and Black communities in the higher numbers. In Massachusetts, you see those pockets in Everett, Lawrence, Lynn, Chelsea. These are all my people. Yeah, Rockton. So Dorchester, right?
Yep.
These are the places. And who lives in those places, right? Cambridge, Somerville, Beacon Hill, Brookline, like almost no infection, right? Chestnut Hill, none. Like the numbers are minimal compared to like 5% infection rate in Chelsea and those places. So it is clear, and I think it's been clear from all of the racism and the disparities that this continues to be the case with COVID-19. Now, I will tell you, would there be a different focus if all the people that were dying were white millionaires? If COVID was making white millionaires die, would we be where we are now? Okay. And the answer is no. Somebody would fix that. The same answer is if teenage white boys were getting killed by police, would we still let that happen? No, because the white people would be like, no, we're not going to let this happen, right? So when you look at this, is COVID has impacted, in my opinion, my work and the work of all the corporations I work with, in that it has clearly highlighted that the disparities are real, that the disparities play out in a pandemic, that the disparities play out in an in a racist community, that the disparities continue. And I think that's why many of us are still on the bandwagon, if I may, and I hope it continues, to be able to say something about the current blatant inequities that exist within our community, right? In Boston, Massachusetts, it's considered one of the most racist cities in the country. A Black family has assets of average of $8, compared to a white family who has assets of $220,000. When they did a study about how many people were at the Museum of Fine Arts that were not white people, they found less than 1% on a given weekend. How many Black or brown people were at restaurants in downtown Boston? Less than 5%. How many kids of color were at the Children's Museum? Less than 6%. Okay, why is this the case, right? Because we live in a society that doesn't put forth, I mean, it costs $18 to take your kid to the Science Museum, right? If your assets are $8 as a family, you can't take half of a kid, right? So what are we doing as a community to change some of those metrics? And COVID-19 has just exemplified it. People will say, let's fix the system. The system's not broken. The system was designed this way. We need to change the whole system, throw the system out and start over. And companies have the opportunity to do that. If you have leadership and metrics and you put the right structures together and you bring in the right talent and you have the hard conversations and you structure things where they're measurable. Hey, Johnny, great that you did 120% of your sales. What's going on with retaining your people of color talent, man? You've lost like 3 young men that are, you know, 2 Latinos and a Black kid. What happened? Right? Are we having those kinds of conversations? Are we setting up those kinds of metrics?
And I would follow up with a question of, hey, Johnny, how much of that sale is in a new market or in a niche market? And, you know, so that we tie in the conversation around truly engaging diverse markets. When it comes to how has this COVID-19 impacted our work, with an organization, it made it even more urgent. You know, I'm tied with the social unrest and the murder of, George Floyd. It absolutely generated, this is how it's impacted. It's generated everyone wanting to do something about it, everyone wanting to say something about it. My concern is, are we going to follow up what we say with the right money and the right, efforts? That's one. Two, but for us, it made it very evident. It made it evident in a couple of places. One, we had to shift to telemedicine, like most people shift to, telework and all of that. We shift to telemedicine. So we needed to ensure that our diverse patient population was also jumping onto telemedicine on the same proportions, right? It's not only a matter of do they have the equipment or the technical ability, it's also a matter of do they have a preference. I can tell you, as you see with my name, I'm not Hispanic. And it's taken me forever to convince my mother that a telemedicine consult is as valuable as one where the doctor can actually touch you. She would tell me, no, they can't even touch you or put the stethoscope on you. Why would I waste my time on this? So that's one aspect. The other aspect is in our workforce itself, it became a huge burden for working parents. And I'm sure that everyone is, in any place, it's looking at this aspect of it, because now you're not only working from home, but you're teaching, you're so on and so forth. Third, the third aspect of it is this connectedness to mission, to the team. Some cultures, some of us prefer more relationship-based work environment, so on and so forth. When it was 1 month and we all thought we were going to come back in 45 days, people can take it. Now we have told our staff that they're going to be back June next year. Now everyone is in for the long haul, and people are are struggling with this. Some individuals are struggling with that. So three different aspects. It's gotten more support. It's gotten people are ready to make bolder decisions. And everyone's concern, even our own ERDs and everything, is all right. Let's focus on coming out with the statements of what we're truly going to do, rather than trying to be, statements that encompass everything.
Yeah, I appreciate those points. I think it's well taken that this whole moment has shifted everything, right, for everybody. The two pandemics, as it's called, right, both on the racial front and also with COVID and the disparities that have been exposed for some in that regard. I think at Vanguard, it's been interesting because I'm newer to the culture. I've been there for 2 years, but as I talk to my colleagues who have been there for, over a decade, they have told me that things have shifted tremendously. In part, I can't fully see it because I'm new, and that's been the anchoring of my work, right? But when we look at the organization, I think COVID and George Floyd served as an impetus for us to strengthen and further lean in and invest even more in this work. And I think we had a pivotal moment where we did an 8-minute, 46-second moment of silence, which was coupled with a digital narrative that showed the various pictures of different mothers and different Black people who have been murdered, and kind of depicted a story of what led us to this moment, because we are a predominantly white organization, and for many people they just had no exposure or way to conceptualize like what was happening and why this happened, and that it wasn't only a one-time thing. But I think that really represented a cultural shift for us, because then that was followed with subsequent lean-in conversations, some hosted by our ERGs, some hosted by business units, where we were talking about the 1619 Project, talking about white fragility, talking about all these things that they had never really talked about in the culture. And so I think a lot has changed at Vanguard, as well as many organizations, but in the right direction, so they can lean in more heavily with DEI. I think for many, new hires, as they're looking at, is my organization going to respond? This is a good calibrating moment, right? Did they respond just at George Floyd, or are they still talking about it? Are they really leaning in, or was that just like a blip on the radar? So I think you can also discern a lot about an organization if they're continuing the work or if it was just a one-time thing as well.
Yeah, I think all of that is exactly right. And just to add on quickly, the impact of COVID-19, it's been real. It's been really real. And the impact of the social unrest and what we're seeing in the world, it's just been real. And so it's had a unique impact to our work at the Red Cross. It has changed how we respond to emergencies and disasters. It has changed how we stand up a shelter. You know, at one point you've got, you know, we use gymnasiums, high school facilities, convention centers to open a shelter. Well, in the age of COVID-19, you can't exactly operate the same way. But the greatest impact that we've seen from COVID-19, and in addition to the social unrest that we're seeing right now, has been how we are able to collect blood and blood product. So here's an interesting fact. You know, before COVID-19, well, let me start here. There's a disease that's called sickle cell disease, sickle cell anemia. The predominant patient of sickle cell disease is Black African American, okay? The blood product used to treat sickle cell disease, particularly in Black and African American people, comes from the Black and African American community, okay? So you add COVID-19, the impact of COVID-19, where we're having to close down blood drives, right? Already our African American donorship was low. 3% of our African American donorship is African American. COVID-19 strikes, that measly 3% that we were attaining has dwindled even more. Then you add the social unrest on top of that, and it dwindles even more, right? And so sickle cell disease and treatment for sickle cell disease, it's still a very real thing, right? People are still sick with the disease. People still need treatment from the disease. But because of COVID-19 and social unrest, the donorship is not there, which means the blood product is not there. So it certainly has had a crippling effect in how we do what we do and how we respond to rare blood needs. So we are undergoing a massive outreach specific to our Black African American donors to appeal for a very real and present disease like sickle cell that still exists and still needs to be cared for. So it's created a very interesting and, dare I say, dire dynamic in the biomedical services blood space.
Would anyone else like to comment before we move on? So as a representative of your organization, what strategies and programs have you implemented with the goal of recruiting a more diverse group of candidates? Or what steps or actions do you recommend companies take in recruiting diverse candidates?
Yeah, I can kick us off here because I'm super fired up about the work that we do in the HBCU and HSI space. I think, you know, it's easy to say, oh, we can't find the talent, they're not there. But we're here, right? We're here, we exist, and it's just a matter of knowing where to go and actually challenging recruiting apparatuses too to upskill their teams, make sure that those teams are diverse, and make sure that they're well versed on how to get in relationship with certain communities to access the talent. So I think for Vanguard, some pillars that we have in our strategy from a diversity standpoint is having really strategic, mutually beneficial partnerships with HBCUs. So not just going to get the talent and leave, but, you know, supporting curriculum development, cultivating externship types of programs, connection with faculty and administrators, you know, giving funds during COVID relief because of the crisis that has hit that ecosystem. So I think those are important. I think also fostering strategic partnerships with diversity organizations. Many are similar to a program that I went through. I'm a proud Inroader. So I'm an Inroads alum from the Central New England affiliate in Boston, and can understand some of those stats that Grace was sharing, right? About Boston, you know, being known for being, you know, very kind of harsh to people of color in certain regards. But I think it's important to partner with organizations like an Inroads or like an SEO, MLT, you know, Afrotech, Jopwell. There are so many, but I think that is something that we're really excited to lean into strategic partnerships to help us to make sure that we're attracting high-po talent across the board.
So we start early on. We have strong partnerships with the Boston Public School. We like to say with schools within a mile of where we operate. So we bring in around 68 students year round, both in the summer and to at the academic year, to expose them, to give them jobs, to skill building, and so on and so forth. Our programs start in 9th grade and goes all the way up to now freshmen in med school, where we bring in, once they're accepted into the Harvard School of Med, then we bring in underrepresented medicine, so Black and brown individuals, before they start school, to join a program where we are just exposing them to oncology and what we do and so on and so forth. But most importantly, we're giving them a network so that when they start year one of the school, they're better suited for success. We know that a lack of a network of peers and similars to me is a contributor to actually a poor experience in your academic schools and in med school in particular. So our programs, they go scholarship, they do college placement, we take kids to college tours and so on. So that's what we do for, from ninth grade to graduate school. And then we have other specific strategies, as again I was saying, different partnerships, and quite frankly, defining. There was a study done over 40 years of data after affirmative action, and people hated it. It was called diversity dilution. And at the end of the day, it found that only organizations that actually set goals around it made change. It wasn't the training, it wasn't anything. It was, do you have a goal? So we actually, those were some of our goals are around specific diversifying at specific levels of the organization, directors and above, vice presidents and above. So those are amongst the different things that we're doing.
So one of the things we've done at the Chamber is we've created the only LGBTQ job board. So we welcome all of our corporate partners to post jobs that say, I'm specifically looking for LGBTQ talent. And so if you are, I think back when I realized I wanted to live in a more welcoming environment than Houston, Texas, after I graduated from Rice. I wish there had been some way to know where you go, where you can actually be out in your corporation and be welcomed and be looked for. Not only are you welcome, but they want you. I'm looking for you, right? We had our first, and we have 3 job fairs where our corporate partners also come and recruit from LGBTQ talent. And we had the first trans job fair 3 years ago. And it was amazing to see that our corporate partners all showed up with all their, marketing materials and you guys in suits and all that. And some of the talent that showed up was like, wow, nobody's ever wanted to hire me, right? And that was an emotional moment for me, because these are companies that are saying, hey, we haven't hired trans folks and we're not even sure we're like right in all of our cultural ways, but we are here and we are looking for you, right? So if any of you are looking to work in an LGBTQ inclusive space, jump on our job board and see what jobs are posted. And then our corporate partners post their jobs there. It's a relatively new job board, so it's not super, populated yet, but that's part of what we're working on. And I think, I would love to see sort of and maybe they exist, Diana, you probably know more than I do, but maybe there is a person of POC, person of color job board where talent can go, where recruiters and folks that are looking to hire can go and post jobs.
And then really quickly at the Red Cross, I think we've begun the work in earnest, I will say, in diving into quantifying our 300,000 plus volunteers that we have. We first want to know, who they are, how they identify. And so we've just the beginning part of this year undertook a massive survey effort to ask them to identify race, ethnicity, orientation. So again, we can quantify and know how that breaks out. Then from that perspective, we can begin our recruiting to fill those gaps. We work with a lot of local partners. I think Ayana spoke to a lot of this, Grace as well, Itamaro as well, where you're working with partners, you're incorporating mentoring strategies. So we've now used our resource groups, as Grace referred to. We're using our resource groups, our affinity groups, to do some more mentoring, structuring mentoring programs specifically with our African American and Latino workforce. And those are proving to be very fruitful. So again, really just echoing the comments that are already shared by my colleagues.
What would you say to students who may feel targeted or tokenized by diversity recruitment programs?
I would say don't feel that way. Here's the thing. I went into and I say don't feel that way because you know what historically happens is people that, you know, have had the opportunity to have their social circles where the people of influence come in, and it's the club and it's the golfing. That's their targeted diversity recruitment effort. When they come into these clubs and they have a connection and they say, hey, I need an internship for my kid. Oh, my kid is looking for. So these programs that are designed to focus on recruiting diverse talent, you know, as I mentioned, that's how I got into the American Cancer Society. It was their diversity program. And maybe you know, my experience didn't say that, but maybe someone said we have to have a diversity program because this is what's trendy right now. But I took advantage of it. So think of the program as what does it give you? It gives you the opportunity to expose your talents, to build a network. And by the way, organizations are looking into it because they have a program and they need it to be successful. Out of that, I was an international student in 2001 where the September 11th had just happened. No one wanted to hire international students because the news got around that they came on international businesses, on international visas. So I ended up being then sponsored my H-1 and my citizenship through a diversity recruitment program. So I would say try to look at it from the perspective of how does it benefit you, what is it exposing you to, and what opportunities it's bringing to you. That's my point there.
Yeah, and I'm gonna jump on that too. I just want to say two things. Know your value and be selective, right? You have to know that you have a value to offer, and to know that with confidence, right? Know that with confidence that you have great value in the marketplace, and you have the right to be selective and to ask the questions that Grace and others have mentioned earlier, and to choose to go where you feel wanted and where you feel respected and where you feel included.
Absolutely. I mean, I will echo both Ilemaro and Ayana. I may have gotten a lot of my opportunities through tokenism, but once I got that opportunity, I seized it, right? I was the only woman and the only person of color in my PhD program at the University of Florida. And I had to fight really hard to even be heard in some of the classes, but I made sure that I got that degree before I left there, right? And I took advantage of that opportunity to do that. I think that sometimes the part that I will agree strongly with Ayana on is that, again, this was my experience 20 years ago, right? Nowadays, it's a bit different. Not all the way right, but better, okay? And you have a value, right? Now I can sit here at my fancy age of 50 and say, hey, I can pretty much choose where I want to work, right? I have this experience. I do bring diversity. I have seized many of the opportunities that I've had. And now I sit in a place of being able to choose. And what that does really in your whole career, starting right now, is that you end up being at a place where you feel good. And when you work in a place where you feel good, you're going to do your best work, okay? You're going to have your whole mind and all of your talent going towards contributing to the thing you're doing. If you're worrying about how people are looking at you, or how you're, do they know that I'm gay, or do they know that I'm, why am I always the one getting the coffee sort of stuff, right? If that's the feeling, it's taking away from your opportunity to thrive, and you need to find someplace else to be, because your value is going to be looked at differently someplace else.
Yeah, that's exactly right. I think we're hitting on the key word here, which is value. It really is value. I don't think the, millionaire feels tokenized. I don't think the celebrity feels tokenized when they're being sought out for their gifts and their talents and their resources, right? And neither should we. right? As people of color, you know, as the aging population, ability population, LGBTQ, we have values and resources and assets that we can bring to any organization, any institution, any enterprise. And so it really is about understanding that value and recognizing that it is of great utility to any business, organization, institution that is progressive and wanting to succeed within diverse communities.
I think the thread that we've been all implying is, if the only thing the organization is doing is a diversity recruitment program, then, you know, look a different way. If the recruitment program comes with a retention strategy, comes with the strategic partnerships, with the employee resource group, with your understanding, you know what, they use focus groups and our opinions are counted, whether I'm a millennial Black or just simply a millennial, is, you know, if I'm being heard different ways, if it all comes together, then the organization is truly trying to weave this into their culture with success or not success, but at least the effort is there. So I would be less concerned. The advice is, don't think of a single event or strategy as representative of the full culture of the organization. Try to understand the breadth of what they're doing.
I think another thing that's important is nobody is doing it 100%. Okay? Because this is one of those things that's impossible to do 100%, right? So I'm a woman of color. I'm a Mexican, I'm an immigrant, I'm a lesbian, I'm 5'1". Like, I could tell you all the ways by which I am very diverse and unequitable, right? But I have privilege, right? I sit in privilege. A cheap bottle of wine for me is my neighbor's breakfast for a week. And I don't see that. So in all of our difference, right? In all of our difference, nobody's doing it 100%. The organizations that are doing it the best is the ones that are able to sit down and say, we're not doing it 100%, but we sure as hell are trying. And here's where we're putting it all. And there's no bad discussion that we can have. We're going to have all the discussions. And we're not going to have all the answers on all the discussions because this is hard stuff. And we have privilege that we don't even know about, right? There are things I do in a day that I don't think twice about that could be a completely different impact for another Mexican woman living up the street that doesn't have my same access or my same income or my same whatever, right? Nobody does it 100%, but it is very clear that you don't have to dig very far for you to find out who is doing it as best as they can or trying to do it as best as they can.
Thank you. So I think we already started going over this a little bit, but if we want to address it briefly, what suggestions do you have for students as they assess whether a workplace will offer what they need to thrive? So what specific questions might students ask in the job interview process to better understand an organization's culture?
I'm going to jump into the questions themselves so that they're more relevant to the students. I would ask two things. I would ask whoever's interviewing me, beyond the recruiter, at the hiring manager, and so on and so forth, how do they integrate inclusion, diversity, and equity into what they do on a daily basis in your team? So don't make it the huge organization and they'll give you what they're donating to. And in your team, how do you bring it to life? And then we've talked enough about the ERGs. So a follow-up question I would always ask is, can you tell me a little bit about the exciting work they're doing? That way you understand if the recruiter knows that we have ERGs because it's a sales pitch, or the organization is actually benefiting from the work of the ERG. So those two questions, and I'll let others add more.
I'll add real quickly a couple of suggestions, I think, because I think authentic self is so important. So I would say always, always, always show up as your authentic and professional self. I think that is so very key. And I think Grace touched on this quite a bit in her comments, but I just think that's at the essence of what we perhaps have the responsibility to do, and you as students have the responsibility to do, to show up, as your authentic and professional self. And I think if I offered a second piece of advice, it would be to speak up and to speak out when you have a need. You have to make that known. And I just can't stress that enough. I just think those two rules I've always strived to live by, and I certainly encourage students to do the same.
Yeah, no, I'll chime in too. I think I love Milda Ramos' point around getting underneath the ERG thing, because I think in talking to a lot of students, they'll say, well, you know, I talked to these other companies and they just gave me the standard answer, we have ERGs, right? And they don't really go into it. To your point, maybe the recruiter just knows, you know, that's a part of the talking points, but they're not really living it and it's not embedded in the culture. So I think it is good to sniff that stuff out. I think it's also good to ask the company about their values. Every company has their set, or organization has their set of values. Some of them is just on paper, some actually live it. So for example, Vanguard has as a value community stewardship. So I might ask, how is this community stewardship value expressed in the organization and in your, you know, function? Then I can kind of sniff out if it's really being lived, right, or not. So I think you have to get underneath that. And then I would add too, for students in this day and age, if things like climate change are important to you, if things like, you know, having service in poor communities and giving back is important to you, if racial justice and equity issues are important, ask what that company is doing to contribute in those areas, right? I think it's fair game, and they should be able to answer your question. And if they aren't, that tells you something.
I think that's right on. And I think the right company will say, hey, this kid's paying attention, right? Like this person's like really trying to go. The other thing I would say is don't be shy to say, look, this is my first job and I want to be here for 5 years. Where will I be in 5 years and what will it take for me to get there? Right? Because as you know, as a brown woman entering the workspace, you know, I want to know what kind of programs I can take advantage of in your company that are going to help me thrive, that are going to help me get there. And how can I contribute with my diversity to the work that you're doing? What are you doing around serving the Latino population? You know, Ilimaro, like how can I help? I want to volunteer to help in that space, right? And this will help get you more information of like, oh, wow, in fact, we have this, you know, whatever, and you'd be great at like, you know, participating in that. But if you get like a bunch of like, oh yeah, you know, well, we don't really do that in this process, that's something you do down the path, you know, then you're like, okay, well, all right, gotcha, you know, because somebody who, the right recruiter is going to see that enthusiasm, and they're going to see that you're not just coming there to do your 9 to 5, that you're really coming there because you care about something, and people want passionate people working for them.
I know it's hard when, particularly when it's your first job, you know, to go and feel like, you know, let me ask all these questions and let me put people, I know there's a dynamic there that comes into play, but as a student and as an applicant, you want to understand that as much as they are interviewing you, you need to be interviewing the organization. Think of that as a mindset. What am I? Look around. Do your research. Always do your research in your organization. You want to know if there is an inclusive culture. Have you ever seen this organization on your campus? Or, you know, do you see them in the community? Do you see them? Because that's what makes it part of the culture. Right now, everyone is standing up different things, you know, focused on inclusion and focused on diversity. Who's been there, who will be there, who's, you know, you're hiring your neighbor and so on. So think of the process as also an opportunity for you to evaluate, is this the right organization for me?
And I know Rodney already started leading into this question about being your authentic self, but if anyone had any brief final comments, because I know we're running short on time, what advice can you give to students as job seekers to present themselves authentically in the recruitment process and eventually at work? So I know as career advisors, we often receive questions from students on how to navigate cultural expression at work, or when to disclose information in regards to accessibility needs or international student status.
I mean,
in short, go ahead, Grace.
As I said before, sometimes our diversity is clear. We walk with it on our face. But I can't tell you how many times I wish now in my past I had been able to sit in an interview and say, what is your workspace offer for LGBTQ folks, right? Because that would have brought a different authenticity to the work that I didn't bring for some years. So I think, you know, some of it has to do with the time you know, when I was having and the space. But I think today, being able to say that actually gives the recruiter some access, and this is all if you're comfortable or whatever, it gives the recruiter some access towards the diversity that they might not even see from what your resume says, and could be of an interest.
Yeah, I would add too, I think when it comes to, you know, just general advice around authenticity in the recruitment process, become a great storyteller. Become a great storyteller. Stories connect humans, right? They just connect us. And so it instills some level of commonality and connection between you and the person that's interviewing you. And it also helps you put your guard down a little bit and stop being so kind of, you know, formulaic with your answers. So I would say become a great storyteller. I would say to international students, you know, I'm a first generation citizen, and I know this time is one of the most difficult times to get employment as an international student. I think you have to be extremely creative. I think you have to put your best foot forward, and they will ask you the question, right, around sponsorship, around eligibility, around visa status, but put your best foot forward. I've worked with many students. I'm an educator, also do adjunct work at Temple University. And so many of my international students that have kind of finally broken through, how they broke through was putting their best foot forward first, getting in connection with an organization that was open enough to consider them, and then they were able to get placed. It takes time, takes a lot of no's getting in your face, but it is possible for you to find the way to break through. But I think you have to allow yourself to put your best foot forward before you kind of sprinkle in and spit out status. Put your best foot forward, see where the conversation goes. You might be surprised, right?
And again, I want to reinforce what you're saying because it's so critical. I was an international student myself. This is where you take advantage of the diversity recruitment efforts, because while you're in school, you're authorized to work here. So, as you know, whatever hours. So take the opportunity to let the organization know you, and then, as you said, they will, you know, bring the conversation up. Do not. It's my advice, not my organization's advice, by the way. I say disclose when asked, and never, you know, lie in an application, because that will always come back. Hey, lying in an application is an excuse to end your employment even after you're hired. But tell the story, tell your story, and connect it to what the institution is looking for. Those would be a couple of pieces that I had.
So I'd like to open it up to our audience Q&A. So we're going to stop the recording of the session for the remainder of our time.